Picture this: a packed auditorium filled with parents, teachers, and the best young math minds in the state. The tension is thick as the final round of the competition begins. Out walks Chadwick, a black boy with a quiet confidence, though you wouldn't guess it from the nervous whispers rippling through the crowd. "Who's that?" one parent mutters. "No way he made it this far," another scoffs. But there he stands, holding his own. Not that everyone's happy about it, especially Mrs. Riley. You see, Mrs. Riley isn't just any teacher. She's the kind who plays favorites, and Chadwick? He's never made that list. In fact, just minutes before this high-stakes moment, Mrs. Riley pulled Chadwick aside, her voice dripping with disdain. "You shouldn't even be here," she sneered. "This competition isn't for kids like you. Do yourself a favor and let someone else take your spot. Someone who actually stands a chance." But Chadwick didn't back down. He met her gaze head-on. "I earned my place," he said firmly. "And I'm staying." Mrs. Riley scoffed, brushing him off. But what she didn't know, Chadwick wasn't just here to compete, he was here to win. The final problem lights up the screen. A tangled mess of equations that leaves the other contestants frozen in confusion. The room is silent except for the sound of Chadwick's pencil scratching against paper. Minutes pass. Whispers ripple through the audience. "He's stuck," someone mutters. Even Mrs. Riley shakes her head, already writing him off. But then suddenly Chadwick stops. His eyes light up, like a puzzle piece finally clicked into place. He writes furiously, numbers flowing effortlessly. The room holds its breath. And then, the answer flashes on the board. Chadwick solved it. The judges blink in disbelief. Gasps ripple through the crowd, followed by stunned silence. And Mrs. Riley? Her face is a mix of shock and disbelief. This was the boy she tried to tear down. The boy she said didn't belong. And now he stands as the champion. But this story isn't just about winning a competition. It's about resilience, courage, and proving that talent knows no color. What would you have done if someone told you that you didn't belong? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your story. And if you're ready for more inspiring stories like this one, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Chadwick's journey is far from over. Winning that competition should have been the moment Chadwick proved his doubters wrong once and for all, especially Mrs. Riley. But every triumph has a story behind it. Let me take you back to where it all began. Chadwick wasn't just any 12-year-old. Sure, he was shy, but beneath that quiet demeanor was a brilliant mind. One that saw numbers not as problems but as opportunities for discovery. He had always loved math. For Chadwick, solving equations was like unlocking a hidden language. But life had thrown him a challenge far tougher than any math problem. He and his mother had just moved to this predominantly white neighborhood. The reason? Something emotional his mother didn't talk about much. Lisa, his mother, had wanted a fresh start, a place where Chadwick could thrive. Lisa wasn't just a mother. She was a fighter, a hardworking real estate agent with grit and determination. She knew Chadwick was special, and no matter how hard things got, she always remained. Him. Never dim your light just because someone else can't handle its shine. But even with his mom's unwavering support, fitting into this new environment wasn't easy. Chadwick's first day at his new school was anything but blissful. He walks through the hallway, nervous but hopeful. The walls are lined with achievement plaques and trophies, all showcasing the school's academic excellence. It's clear, this is a place that takes pride in its success. But that pride came with an ugly truth. Standing at the front in his classroom was Mrs. Riley, a sharp-eyed teacher with a strict demeanor and a subtle but undeniable air of superiority. "Class, "We have a new student," she announced, her tone laced with condescension. "This is Chadwick." Her eyes swept over him briefly before turning back to the class. And then, almost under her breath but loud enough for a few students nearby to hear, "They just admit anyone these days. Charity cases, just to fulfill a diversity quota." The words hung in the air like poison, sinking into the minds of the students. Some snickered quietly. Chadwick heard every word but kept his head down, determined not to let it show. From that moment on, Mrs. Riley made it clear Chadwick wasn't one of her favorites. Fast forward to a math lesson later that week. The class was working through a complex problem, and Mrs. Riley called on Chadwick. "Well, what's the answer?" she demanded, tapping her foot impatiently. Chadwick paused. N.O.T. because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to try solving it in a new way, one he had thought of the night before. He took a deep breath and began explaining his approach, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. Mrs. Riley's eyes narrowed. "Wrong," she snapped before he could finish. "I guess I shouldn't be surprised. Some people just aren't cut out for this." The class erupted into laughter, the sound bouncing off the walls like an echo of humiliation. But Chadwick didn't break. He knew what he was capable of, even if Mrs. Riley refused to see it. Later that evening, Chadwick sat at his small desk, the same math problem from earlier still swirling in his mind. Mrs. Riley might have mocked him in front of the entire class, but Chadwick wasn't ready to give up just because she said he was wrong. Numbers were his world, a place where he could explore, discover, and think differently. And tonight, he was determined to prove there was a better way to solve that problem. His pencil scratched furiously against the paper, erasing and rewriting till suddenly it all came together. Chadwick had found it. Not just the solution, but an entirely new, faster way to tackle the problem. He couldn't contain his excitement. "Mom!" he called out, jumping from his chair. Lisa, tired from another long day of showing homes as a real estate agent, walked in with curiosity written all over her face. "What's going on, sweetheart?" she asked, setting down her work bag. Chadwick beamed. "Look, I figured it out. And not just that, I found a way to solve it faster. See?" Lisa leaned over, eyes narrowing as she studied the numbers. She wasn't a math expert, but even she could see that her son had done something impressive, something rare. "Chadwick," she said slowly, pride swelling in her voice, "this is incredible." He grinned. "I just thought, what if there's an easier way?" And then it all made sense. Lisa paused, looking at her son with new eyes, not just as her boy, but as someone with extraordinary potential. "I always you were special," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But this is just the beginning. I'm going to do whatever it takes to support you, Chadwick. You hear me? Whatever it takes." Her words were a promise, one made from love and determination. And Chadwick? He believed her, because if there was one person who had always been in his corner, it was his mom. Now, let me ask you this: if your child at such a young age discovered something brilliant, something that showed they had a rare talent, what would you do? How far would you go to support them? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your story. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Chadwick's journey of bravery and resilience was far from over. It all started with a simple test. Chadwick had worked hard, double-checking every answer, confident that he'd done well. But when Mrs. Riley handed back the graded papers, his heart sank. A bright red D scrawled across the top of his page. Chadwick's brows furrowed as he scanned the sheet. The answers were correct, he knew they were, And he wasn't just guessing. He'd even used that new method he discovered at home with his mom. Quietly, he approached Mrs. Riley's desk. "Excuse me, Mrs. Riley," he said hesitantly, holding up his paper. "I think there might be a mistake. My answers are right." Mrs. Riley didn't even glance up. "If you're here to argue about your grade, save it. Tests are graded based on proven methods, not experiments." "But this method works," Chadwick insisted. "It's just a faster way." Mrs. Riley cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Do you think you're the next Einstein or something? Let me give you a piece of advice, Chadwick. Stick to what you're told, and maybe you'll get by." The words stung, but Chadwick swallowed the hurt. In that moment, something inside him hardened. He made a silent promise to himself. "One day, I'll prove her wrong." But Mrs. Riley wasn't done yet. During a math lesson the following week, she scribbled a problem on the board, her chalk moving with practiced precision. "Who can solve this?" she asked. The class sat in silence. Chadwick hesitated. He knew the answer, and he also saw a mistake Mrs. Riley had made in setting up the problem. Timidly, he raised his hand. "Yes, Chadwick?" Mrs. Riley sighed, already sounding annoyed. I think there's an error in the equation," he said softly. "Right here," he pointed to the board. Mrs. Riley's expression darkened. "Oh, really? Well, I suppose we should all bow down to the math genius in the room. Shouldn't we?" she sneered. "Go on, Chadwick. Enlighten us." The other students snickered, emboldened by her tone. Chadwick's cheeks burned, but he stood his ground. He explained the correction calmly and clearly, despite the growing mockery around him. Mrs. Riley waved a dismissive hand. "Sit down. Maybe one day you'll learn your place." The classroom erupted into laughter, the sound echoing off the walls like a chorus of humiliation. But Chadwick didn't shrink. He held on to his silent vow, "I'll prove them wrong." Meanwhile, Lisa had noticed Chadwick coming home quieter, more withdrawn. As a mother, she knew when something was wrong. So when the school scheduled a parent-teacher meeting, she saw it as her chance to get answers. Lisa walked in to that meeting with her head held high, determination radiating from every step. Mrs. Riley greeted her with a polite but icy smile. "Thank you for coming," she said curtly. "Let's get straight to it," Lisa said firmly. "I'm here because I believe my son is being treated unfairly." Mrs. Riley's brows lifted in mock surprise. "Oh, I assure you, Mrs. Johnson, all students are treated equally." Lisa's eyes narrowed. "Then explain the grade he got on that math test when every answer was correct. Or the way you dismissed his discovery of a new solution. And let's not forget the comments you've made about sticking to his place." Mrs. Riley shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught off guard. I am not sure where you're getting these ideas. I grade based on merit, not personal opinions." "Personal opinions?" Lisa repeated, her voice sharp. "Sounds more like prejudice to me. Let's be clear. Just because Chadwick doesn't fit your idea of who belongs in this school doesn't mean he's in. Why less deserving?" Mrs. Riley fluttered, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Now hold on. I would never discriminate against a student. I'm simply holding Chadwick to the same high standards as everyone else." "Is that right?" Lisa challenged. "Then why is he the only student being mocked in your class without you stepping in? Why is he the only one whose achievements are dismissed?" Mrs. Riley's facade cracked for a brief moment before she plastered on a forced smile. "I assure you, Mrs. Johnson, I only want what's best for Chadwick." Lisa stood, her voice unwavering. "Good, because I'm going to make sure he gets what he deserves, respect and recognition." As she left the room, Lisa's resolve was stronger than ever. Mrs. Riley might have thought she held the power, but Lisa knew better. And so did Chadwick. You'd think the discrimination would end here, but no, things just got more intense. One morning in the school's massive assembly hall, the principal, a man with a commanding presence, stood at the front with a microphone in hand. "Students," he announced, his voice echoing across the room, "I'm thrilled to inform you that the statewide mathematics championship is just around the corner. This is one of the most prestigious competitions in the state, and we'll be sending our best and brightest to represent our school." The excitement in the room was electric. Students whispered eagerly, dreaming of being chosen as the winner would have a statewide recognition and a scholarship into any school of their choice. Chadwick sat quietly among them, his heart racing. He wanted to raise his hand to volunteer, but he knew what was coming. Mrs. Riley, standing off to the side with her usual scowl, shot a pointed glance in his direction as if daring him to even think about it. But Chadwick wasn't backing down this time. Later that day, when sign-ups were posted, he made his way to the sheet, ignoring the whispers and ickers from his classmates. He wrote his name in bold letters, Chadwick Johnson. Word spread quickly. "Did you hear?" One student laughed. "Chadwick thinks he's gonna compete in the math championship." "Yeah, right," another sneered. Mrs. Riley probably signed him up as a joke, but Chadwick ignored them. He had bigger things to focus on. At home, Lisa's eyes lit up when he told her. "That's amazing, Chadwick," she beamed. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, Mom," he said quietly, "but I have to win. I just have to." And so began weeks of relentless preparation. Every night, long after most kids his age were asleep, Chadwick was at his desk, surrounded by textbooks and practice problems. The equations that once felt like puzzles now became second nature. His pencil flew across the pages, solving problem after problem. Lisa would occasionally peek in, her heart swelling with pride. "You're doing great," she'd say softly, bringing him a snack. But Chadwick barely heard her, his mind laser-focused on the competition ahead. Then came the day that pushed everything to the brink. During a public math exercise in Mrs. Riley's class, Chadwick was called to the board. "Let's see if our little genius can solve this," Mrs. Riley said mockingly, writing a complex equation on the board. Chadwick took a deep breath and began working through the problem. His solution was elegant, efficient, brilliant even, but Mrs. Riley wasn't interested in brilliance. "Wrong," she declared loudly before Chadwick could even finish. "Figures. I guess I was expecting too much." The classroom fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. But this time Chadwick didn't. "Stay silent." "It's not wrong," he said firmly, turning to face her. "You didn't even look at my solution." Mrs. Riley's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me? You always do this," Chadwick continued, his voice steady. "You treat me like I'm not good enough just because I'm different. But I'm done letting you make me feel small." The class gasped. No one had ever spoken to Mrs. Riley like that. But instead of listening, she escalated the situation. "That's enough," she snapped. "Go to the principal's office. Now." Chadwick grabbed his things, his head held high. He wasn't ashamed, he was done being humiliated. Lisa didn't waste any time when she heard what happened. She marched straight into the school, her eyes blazing with determination. "I want a meeting with the principal," she demanded. It didn't take long for her voice to echo through the halls. The formal complaint she filed against Mrs. Riley wasn't just about Chadwick. It was about justice, fairness, and stand-in. G up to Prejudice. Meanwhile, Chadwick's resolve only grew stronger. He doubled down on his preparation, blocking out every distraction, every doubt. And then the moment came. The list of students who had qualified for the statewide championship was posted. Chadwick scanned the names, his heart pounding. There it was. Chadwick Johnson. He'd done it. If you're inspired by Chadwick's journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The big day finally arrived. The prestigious statewide math competition. The venue was packed with parents, teachers, and students, all eager to witness a battle of intellect and wit. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that makes your heart race even if you're just in the audience. Chadwick stood near the entrance, his face calm but determined. He wasn't just here to compete, he was here to prove something. Lisa was right there with him, smiling proudly. "You've got this, baby," she said softly. "I'm already proud of you." "Thanks, Mom," Chadwick whispered. But then came an all-too-familiar presence. Mrs. Riley swept into the room, her expression as sour as ever. She wasn't alone. Beside her was her favorite student, Tyler Green, the school's so-called math prodigy. Mrs. Riley shot a smug glance in Chadwick's direction, as if daring him to even dream of winning. "Remember," she said loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "the key to winning, G, is preparation, not luck." Chadwick didn't flinch. He was past letting her get under his skin. The competition kicked off with a bang. Round after round, students were eliminated, leaving only the best of the best. Chadwick breezed through the early challenges, his pencil moving with lightning speed as he solved problem after problem. Lisa watched from the audience, beaming with pride. But Mrs. Riley? She sat stiffly in her seat, her expression growing more sour with each passing round. Then came the semifinal round. It was Chadwick versus Tyler. The tension was thick. Even the audience fell silent as the moderator announced the problem, a notoriously difficult equation that required both speed and precision. Tyler's brow furrowed as he scribbled furiously on his paper. He was fast, no doubt about it. But Chadwick? He was calm, methodical. He saw patterns where others saw chaos, solutions where others saw dead ends. And then, bam! Chadwick raised his hand, signaling that he had finished. The moderator checked his answer and smiled. "Correct," he announced. The room erupted in gasps and applause. Tyler sat frozen, disbelief etched on his face. Mrs. Riley? She looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Chadwick had done it. He was moving on to the final round. But there was no time to celebrate. The final challenge was up next, and it was a monster. The moderator cleared his throat. "For the final problem, you will have 20 minutes to solve this equation. It's one of the most complex problems in mathematical theory." The audience leaned forward, holding their breath. Chadwick's heart pounded, but he focused. This was what he'd trained for. Pencils flew across papers. Sweat beaded on foreheads. The ticking clock was the only sound in the room. Lisa clasped her hands tightly, silently cheering for her son. Minutes felt like hours. And then, just as the timer hit the final seconds, Chadwick's hand shot up. The moderator approached, checking his solution carefully. A smile spread across the judge's face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we have a winner, Chadwick Johnson." The room exploded in applause. Lisa leapt to her feet, tears streaming down her face. "That's my boy," she shouted proudly. Reporters rushed forward, microphones in hand. "Chadwick," one asked, "how does it feel to win against all odds?" Chadwick smiled humbly. "It feels amazing, but I just wanted to prove that it doesn't matter where you come from or what people think about you. What matters is what you believe about yourself." The crowd roared in approval. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Chadwick spotted Mrs. Riley. She stood frozen, her face pale. The praise Chadwick was receiving, from other teachers and officials, seemed to hit her like a ton of bricks. One teacher leaned over to Mrs. Riley and whispered, "You must be proud to have had Chadwick in your class. His genius is remarkable." Mrs. Riley forced a weak smile, but the truth was written all over her face. She had been wrong, very wrong, and now she had to face that uncomfortable truth. Let me ask you this: have you ever had someone doubt your abilities, only for you to prove them wrong in a big way? Share your story in the comments. And if you're inspired by Chadwick's bravery and determination, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Standing on that competition stage, Chadwick Johnson took a deep breath. The thunderous applause had only just begun to die down, but the emotions running through him were overwhelming. With the microphone in his hand, he looked out over the crowd. His mother, Lisa, still beaming with pride. Reporters eager for their next soundbite. Students and teachers alike frozen in amazement. Chadwick cleared his throat, steadying himself. He spoke with the wisdom and grace far beyond his 12 years. "First, I just want to thank my mom," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "She believed in me when no one else did. She told me I could be great even when others said I couldn't. Everything I've done today is because of her." Lisa wiped tears from her eyes, mouthing the words, "I love you." Chadwick continued, this time addressing the audience. "See directly. I know what it's like to be doubted," he said. "To walk into a room and feel like everyone has already decided what you're worth. I know what it's like to hear people say you don't belong, just because of who you are or where you come from." The room grew silent, hanging on to every word. "But here's what I learned," Chadwick said firmly. "What people think about you doesn't matter nearly as much as what you believe about yourself. You can't let their voices become louder than your own. Keep pushing, keep believing, and one day, they'll have no choice but to see you for who you really are." The crowd erupted once again, this time with even more fervor. If you're loving this story of resilience and triumph, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss more inspiring content just like this one. But Chadwick's story wasn't over yet. Back at school, things took an interesting turn. Lisa's formal complaint against Mrs. Riley had sparked an investigation. It didn't take long for the school board to uncover a pattern of bias and misconduct. The whispers, the unfair grading practices, it was all there, plain as day. The verdict? Mrs. Riley was reassigned to, let's call it administrative duties, if sorting files can be called that, far away from any classroom. Justice. Finally. Meanwhile, Chadwick's story had spread like wildfire across the school. He was no longer the kid people overlooked or mocked. He was a legend. A symbol of brilliance and perseverance. Even Tyler Green, Mrs. Riley's former favorite, approached Chadwick in the hallway one day. "Hey man," Tyler said sheepishly. "Congrats. You really are a genius." Chadwick simply nodded with a smile. He didn't need validation anymore, but it was nice to see that respect had finally been earned. Now fast forward 30 years into the future. Chadwick Johnson stood on another stage, but this time it wasn't a competition. It was a prestigious mathematics conference, and Chadwick, now a renowned mathematician, was delivering the keynote address. "People often ask me how I got here," he said to a captivated audience. "And the truth is, I wouldn't be standing here today without the struggles I faced as a kid. Those challenges shaped me, made me stronger, and taught me to never give up." The camera panned to a photograph displayed proudly on the screen behind him. It was a picture of young Chadwick and Lisa, their arms wrapped around each other, beaming with pride. Back at their family home, That same photograph hung in a place of honor, a symbol of triumph, resilience, and the power of belief. Because sometimes the greatest stories aren't just about winning. They're about overcoming. So what do you think? How do you handle people who underestimate you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep this conversation going. And remember, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, uplift, and remind you that greatness is possible for everyone.